Good morning, everybody. I want to update something we've been tracking closely because the story has moved fast, and today, specifically, August the 4th, is actually a live moment inside it. We're going to walk through how Israel's Knesset dissolution has evolved into a full campaign over the past few weeks, and why, the more details come in, the more this looks like the single toughest political fight of Benjamin Netanyahu's career. Quick recap for anyone just joining this story. In the early hours of Friday, July the 17th, Israel's Knesset formally dissolved, having completed its full 4-year term, the first time that's happened since 1988, nearly 4 decades ago. The dissolution vote passed 62-0, but that number is misleading on its own because it only reflects coalition lawmakers who chose to participate. The opposition spent that final week boycotting and walking out, protesting a legislative blitz that included contested judicial overhaul measures, ultra-Orthodox focused legislation, and a temporary extension of mandatory military service from 30 to 32 months, even as the deeper question of whether ultra-Orthodox men should face conscription at all remained untouched. The election that dissolution triggered is set for October the 27th, described by Bloomberg as effectively a referendum on Netanyahu himself, now 76 years old, and Israel's longest-serving prime minister. That's where we left off. Here's what's happened since, and it's a lot. Let's start with what's actually happening today, because it's a meaningful data point in its own right. Likud is holding its internal party primaries today, August the 4th. As part of positioning ahead of this vote, Netanyahu has been working to strengthen his personal control over the party's candidate list through 10 reserved slots reserved for candidates of his own choosing, alongside broader internal reforms to the primary process itself. Think about what that tells you. A leader entering a general election from a position of true strength doesn't typically need to consolidate personal control over his own party's internal candidate selection process. Reserved slots and internal reform efforts are tools you reach for when you're worried about your own base drifting, not when you're confident it's solidly behind you. That's not a definitive judgment on today's outcome, but it's a meaningful signal about the internal anxiety inside Likud heading into this campaign. Now here's the development I think is the single most revealing thing that's happened since dissolution, because it shows you Netanyahu reacting in real time to a mistake his own coalition made. Remember that final legislative blitz we talked about? The bills benefiting ultra-Orthodox or Haredi communities, including a law preventing the arrest of Haredi draft dodgers and a piece of legislation known as Basic Law, Torah Study. At the time, that legislation was pushed through as a coalition priority. In the weeks since, it's become clear that this legislation caused real electoral damage to Likud, damage serious enough that even some members within the coalition itself openly criticized it. So what has Netanyahu done since? He's reversed course. In recent days, he's launched uncharacteristically direct criticism and attacks against the very Haredi parties, whose priorities he'd just spent the final legislative session accommodating. According to reporting on The Shift, the strategic goal here is transparent: distance himself from the Haredi parties before the election to repair the damage with mainstream voters, with the clear intention of quietly returning to that same political alliance after the election, once the votes he needs from the broader electorate are already banked. I want you to sit with that for a second, because it's about as clean an example of electoral opportunism as you'll see in real time. During the previous term, especially through the draft exemption crises, Netanyahu specifically avoided attacking the Haredi parties, or the more extreme factions within his own coalition, protecting a governing relationship he needed to stay in power. Now, with an election on the horizon and clear evidence that relationship is costing him votes, he's willing to publicly turn on the same partners. With every indication, he intends to quietly rebuild that alliance the moment the ballots are counted. That's not conviction, that's triage. Let's get precise about where the numbers actually stand, because there's real texture here beyond the single seat count snapshot we had at dissolution. Most current surveys place Netanyahu's coalition parties in the low to mid-50s in projected seats, short of the 61 needed for a majority, while the opposition often reaches into the mid to high 50s. That's a genuinely competitive picture with no side holding a clean advantage. There is one notable outlier. Channel 14's polling, which has shown the coalition crossing the 60-seat threshold, reaching as high as 65 seats in some surveys, a very different picture from most other pollsters, and worth flagging as an outlier, specifically because Channel 14 has a well-known editorial lean sympathetic to Netanyahu's coalition. So treat that specific number with appropriate skepticism relative to the broader polling consensus. Most polls also show Arab parties collectively accounting for roughly another 10 seats, and there's a second layer of uncertainty sitting underneath all of this. Several smaller parties are hovering right around Israel's 3.25% electoral threshold, meaning shifts of just a few tenths of a percentage point in the final vote could determine whether roughly 4 additional lawmakers enter the Knesset at all or disappear from the seat count entirely. In a race this tight, threshold parties like that can end up mattering as much as any single headline issue. Here's where the campaign gets genuinely tactical, and I think this is one of the most important dynamics to understand if you want to know how Netanyahu might actually pull this off, despite trailing in most polling. Even though recent polling consistently shows a majority of Israelis supporting parties outside Netanyahu's governing coalition, that majority has never translated into a clear, workable path to an alternative government. Because most Jewish parties, across both the coalition and much of the opposition, remain reluctant to rely on Arab parties as decisive coalition partners, particularly on matters of national security and the character of the state. The left-wing Democratic Party and Eisenkot's own Yashar Party are essentially the only exceptions willing to openly countenance that kind of arrangement. Netanyahu has built one of his most effective campaign arguments directly out of that reluctance. By repeatedly arguing that a figure like Gadi Eisenkot would ultimately have no path to government except by relying on Arab parties, Netanyahu is deliberately raising doubts among moderate right-leaning voters about whether an Eisenkot-led alternative government is even viable, regardless of what the top-line seat projections show. This is a message that's proven salient in previous Israeli election cycles, and there's no obvious reason to expect it to lose its power this time around. That's the structural bind facing Netanyahu's opponents. Even in scenarios where anti-Netanyahu parties collectively poll a majority, actually assembling a government out of that majority runs straight into a decades-old taboo that Netanyahu is actively weaponizing in real time. I want to name something explicitly because I think it's the central tension of this entire campaign, and it explains why so much of the reporting on this race sounds almost contradictory if you read it quickly. Netanyahu enters this campaign in what's genuinely a paradoxical position, weakened politically in almost every measurable sense, yet still Israel's single most dominant political figure. Most surveys show his right-wing and religious coalition falling short of the 61 seats required for a majority. But in direct leadership surveys, asking Israelis who they'd prefer as prime minister, he still outperforms individual named rivals. Head-to-head matchups specifically against former Prime Minister Naftali Bennett, however, are increasingly competitive, reflecting what's being described as broad voter fatigue with Netanyahu after nearly 2 decades of political dominance, even among voters who might still prefer him over other, less familiar alternatives. The paradox is exactly why this election is so hard to call. Netanyahu retains substantial, real advantages. He remains the country's most experienced political operator, with unmatched name recognition and campaign infrastructure. But the erosion underneath that dominance is real and measurable too, showing up in coalition seat projections even where his personal leadership numbers still hold up reasonably well. Let's give Netanyahu's actual argument its full due, because understanding his pitch is essential to understanding why this race remains competitive despite everything working against him. Just months after October the 7th, when many observers assumed his political career was effectively finished, expecting either resignation in shame or removal by a devastated public, Netanyahu has instead built his campaign around the claim that he saved the nation from what he's described as oblivion, pointing to a series of military successes against Iran and its regional proxy militias as the centerpiece of that argument, combined with what remains a fractured multi-party opposition rather than a single unified alternative. That pitch has proven more durable than many expected 2 years ago. It's worth being fair here. Most Jewish Israelis did support military action against Iran, reflecting the country's broadly hawkish security culture, so Netanyahu's emphasis on those military outcomes isn't disconnected from real public sentiment. The genuine question voters are being asked to weigh isn't whether those military actions happened or whether they mattered. It's whether the same leader who oversaw the failures of October the 7th itself is the right person to be credited with and re-elected on the basis of what came after it. There's a structural layer running underneath the entire campaign that I don't want to skip past, because it shapes almost every other issue in this race. Battles over judicial reform have turned the independence of Israel's Supreme Court into a central campaign issue in its own right, a fight that predates this specific election cycle by years, but remains entirely unresolved. Combined with Netanyahu's own ongoing corruption trial, which continues running in parallel with the campaign itself, mounting economic strain on Israeli households, real uncertainty over who governs Gaza once active conflict there subsides, and the continuing confrontations with both Iran and Hezbollah. This election is being described by close observers as a test of whether Israel's deeply strained social contract can actually hold together, not simply a contest over which party wins the most seats. And running through nearly all of it is the accountability question for October the 7th itself. The opposition has consistently demanded a formal state commission of inquiry, an investigation with full legal authority and independence from political appointment. Netanyahu has resisted that specific demand, preferring narrower, internally controlled reviews instead. which is exactly the dynamic we saw play out in the Knesset's final week, when a politically appointed inquiry bill passed its first reading, 59-0 specifically because the opposition boycotted rather than participate in what they view as an inadequate substitute for real accountability. For a great many Israeli voters, this election functions as a direct judgment on Netanyahu's wartime leadership overall. And there's a genuine irony sitting at the heart of that judgment. The very conflicts that allowed him to project strength and rebuild his political standing are the same conflicts voters are using as the lens to evaluate what they consider his failures in the first place. So let's pull all of this together into where the race actually stands as of today. Netanyahu is fighting a two-front battle, and it's worth being explicit about both fronts separately because they require almost opposite strategies. On one front, he's trying to preserve a clearly defined, disciplined governing bloc that's under growing internal strain. Hence today's primary maneuvering, and hence the sudden calculated break with Haredi allies he was protecting just weeks ago. On the other front, he's trying to win the broader national argument about who actually deserves credit or blame for the last several years of conflict and crisis, hence the "I saved the country" framing built around the Iran campaign's military successes. Meanwhile, Eisenkot is working to consolidate a competitive but genuinely fragmented opposition into something resembling a unified alternative, while simultaneously having to manage the exact same Arab Party taboo that Netanyahu is actively using as a wedge against him. And underneath both campaigns, a rapidly forming collection of smaller parties are jockeying right around that 3.25% electoral threshold, any of which could end up mattering enormously to the final seat count in ways that have nothing to do with either headline candidate. Given everything we've just covered, here's what I'd watch most closely between now and October the 27th. First, watch today's leaked primary results themselves, and specifically whether Netanyahu's reserved slot strategy and internal reforms succeed in producing a unified, loyal candidate list, or whether they generate visible internal pushback. A contested or divisive primary process would be a genuine warning sign about the coalition's internal cohesion heading into the general election. Second, watch whether the Haredi parties respond publicly to Netanyahu's sudden criticism of them. Given the reporting that Netanyahu intends to quietly rebuild that alliance after the election, watch for any signs the Haredi leadership understands exactly what's happening and is willing to play along with the arrangement anyway, versus any signs of a genuine lasting rupture that could cost him a coalition partner he's relied on for years. Third, watch whether Eisenkot's Yashar party, or any combination of opposition parties, finds a way to neutralize the Arab party wedge argument directly, rather than simply absorbing the political damage from it election after election. Whoever solves that specific structural problem first gains a real tactical advantage in this race. Fourth, keep an eye on that Channel 14 polling outlier relative to the broader consensus. If other pollsters start converging toward that higher coalition number over the coming weeks, that would be a meaningful signal of real movement toward Netanyahu. If the gap between Channel 14 and everyone else persists or widens, that tells you it's more a reflection of that outlet's specific editorial lean than of any actual shift in the electorate. Fifth, and this one is less about polling and more about substance, watch whether any credible movement develops on a genuine state commission of inquiry into October the 7th, given how central that accountability question is to how voters are evaluating Netanyahu's entire wartime record. Any real shift on that front, in either direction, could move the underlying campaign narrative more than almost anything else between now and Election Day. I've watched a lot of long-serving leaders reach the final stretch of their careers, and there's a specific kind of campaign that emerges when a leader who once seemed politically finished manages to claw his way back to genuine competitiveness. It's rarely a campaign built on unity or a clean, consistent message. It's a campaign built on triage, turning on allies the moment they become a liability, leaning hard into the arguments that still work, even as the ground underneath shifts, and betting that a fractured opposition and the structural taboo around Arab Party coalitions will do more of the work than any single policy pitch could. That's exactly the campaign Benjamin Netanyahu is running right now, weakened in almost every measurable way, and yet still, by a real margin, the most dominant single figure in Israeli politics. Whether that combination is enough to get him through October the 27th is a genuinely open question, closer to a coin flip than either side's most confident supporters would probably like to admit. But given the accumulation of pressures we've walked through today, the corruption trial, the judicial reform fight, the unresolved accountability question over October the 7th, the fractured coalition math, and now a very public break with allies he was protecting just weeks ago, it's hard to see how this doesn't end up being remembered as the single hardest election of his long career, regardless of how it actually turns out. Thanks for watching. Sourcing on everything covered today. The primary details, the polling breakdowns, the Haredi reversal reporting, and the structural analysis of the Arab Party dynamic is linked below so you can verify it all yourselves.